Welcome to Talking Points. I'm Esme Murphy. The SAVE Act passed the U.S. House and it's being debated in the Senate. It stands for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. The act will require voters to prove citizenship with either a birth certificate or passport when registering to vote. The president says the bill is his #1 priority and that the bill, quote, will guarantee the midterms by preventing non-citizens from voting. But Democrats say it will suppress voting by discouraging eligible voters from going to the polls. Joining me to talk about the SAVE Act is Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon. And Secretary, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
All right. The SAVE Act is being debated. It's not clear if it has votes to pass. The debate's going to go on for possibly 2 weeks. What is it, and what are your concerns about it?
Well, the headline of the SAVE Act is that it would impose for the first time in American history a documentary proof of citizenship requirement, meaning you have to show some papers to prove you're a citizen. And the concern is this. We know that it will shut out eligible voters. So we have 69 million women in America who have a different last name than they do from the time they were born. So what would you do in that situation? Well, you have a passport, that's not a problem. But what about the tens of millions who don't have a passport? Well, they'd need to produce both a birth certificate and a marriage record of some kind. And this is not theoretical, by the way. 15 years ago, the state of Kansas experimented with exactly this approach in an election. And before a federal judge struck down that law in Kansas, they had an election under this law. And over 26,000 eligible voters, eligible, like you and me, born and raised, eligible American citizens were shut out of that election. So we have to consider that when we go forward with a step as sweeping as this.
All right. Now, this has passed the House. It's going to be debated in the Senate. It really doesn't seem clear how they can possibly get to 60 votes, yet they are going ahead with this. The president says it's his top priority, that he won't sign any other legislation until this passes. If, for some reason, it did pass and he signed it, it would go into effect immediately. How would that change things here?
That would introduce instant chaos to our election system. I can tell you this, all my colleagues around the country, or most of them at least, agree with that. It's unheard of to have an election law that goes into effect right when it's passed. We are only 220 some days from the election in the fall, and to stand up this kind of system, to be judging birth certificates and judging, marriage records and things like that, the training, all the rest, you need some kind of a runway. Not to mention the fact that we strongly believe that this is based on the faulty premise that somehow there are millions upon millions of ineligible folks voting in America. We know that's not true. We know that's not true in Minnesota. We've got the receipts here in Minnesota. Our system is fair and accurate and honest and secure. And the level of wrongdoing is microscopic in a state like Minnesota.
Well, you're the guy in charge of elections here in Minnesota. I mean, what do the numbers show about people who are non-citizens who illegally vote here in the state?
Yeah, you can look it up. In 2024, there was a professor at the University of St. Thomas, a law school professor, who did a study or a paper on this. He looked at 10 years worth of voting, 2014 through 2023. And during that time, 13.4 million ballots were cast in Minnesota. So in that 10 years, 13.4 million ballots, he found definitive proof of three non-citizens who had voted. Now, that's 3 too many. We want it to be 0. I do, and everyone watching does. But that is really, really good. 3 out of 13.4 million, that means it's really microscopic and certainly not worth introducing the chaos and unfairness of potentially kicking out tens of thousands of eligible Minnesota voters who have been voting for years and decades who might not be able to vote.
There's a larger issue here about people. There are critics of the president say maybe what the president is really trying to do, since it doesn't have the votes in the Senate to pass, is to cast doubts in advance of the 2026 midterms. And when you look at the issue of doubting election results, this is a pretty big deal. A 2023 CNN survey found that 70% of Americans, or 70%, of Republicans surveyed said they thought the Biden 2020 election was illegitimate. In other words, they thought that Trump won that election, which of course is what the president has been saying for years. What does that say to you, and does that concern you?
Well, the president is, again, wrongly concluding that there are millions and millions of people across the country that are voting illegally. We know that is not true. We know that our election system is fair and fundamentally honest. We know that he lost the 2020 election, and he just cannot let that go. In Minnesota, I have to say, the last major Star Tribune Minnesota poll on the subject showed that 79% of Minnesotans across parties, across incomes, across the state, 79% had fundamental confidence in our election system. That's a super high number. Tough to get 79% of people these days to agree on anything in a poll, but they did agree in that last poll that our elections are fundamentally sound.
True, but when you survey Republicans, and this is across the country, you do find a core there that sides with the president. If perhaps some people think it's because it's been repeated over and over and over again, and once something's repeated enough, it becomes the truth in people's minds. But does that concern you?
It does concern me that the president is unfortunately spreading mis and disinformation about the election system, particularly the 2020 election result. And, maybe someday he'll get over that. But in the meantime, we have to keep pushing back, talk about what the facts are, talk about what the system is, particularly in Minnesota, and make sure people, as they do in Minnesota and other states, can enjoy that high level of confidence.
All right. And Minnesota has actually voted on voter ID. This goes beyond voter ID. Voter ID would be a picture, a photograph. This goes beyond that. This is proof of citizenship. A University of Maryland study found that 21 million Americans do not have ready access to a birth certificate or a passport. Is that the kind of thing that has people, critics like you, suggesting this is not a good idea?
Yeah. And, we have that laboratory example in the state of Kansas from a few years ago where they had an election under this system and they had tens of thousands of people turned away and unable to vote, even though they were born and raised U.S. citizens, even though they had been voting in the past, and they couldn't vote because they couldn't produce the one or multiple documents they needed to produce. So bottom line, I think, is, look, this is based on a faulty premise of widespread illegal voting by non-citizens. It would introduce chaos into our system, and it's just plain old unfair because it would shut out tens of thousands of voters in Minnesota, maybe more, who just can't come up with the specific paperwork to show citizenship.
Another thing that this would do is it would require every year for the state to check its voter rolls with the voter rolls from the Department of Homeland Security. You have been in the process of fighting the federal government in terms of turning over voter rolls. Is this one of the things that you're concerned about?
Yeah, very much so. Minnesota's among 32 states, a pretty big majority, that have pushed back against the Department of Justice attempt to get these private personal voter rolls. And by the way, we're not just talking name and address. They want Social Security information, driver's license information, stuff that
it's partial Social Security, right?
That's right, partial Social Security. And this is stuff that federal law, not to mention state law, protects. Again, 32 states. We're one of 32 that have pushed back against that. And this bill, this SAVE Act, would go around the courts in this situation and say, you got to produce this information on all your voters to the federal government. For what purposes, we're not exactly sure. They've never told us what in particular they're going to do with this data, who they're going to share it with, how it's going to be stored or transmitted. That's part of what we're fighting about right now in court. So that's to be continued. But yeah, this would do an end run around the courts and basically sidestep them and force every state in America to turn over this confidential personal information, which federal privacy law says is protected.
Finally, do you worry that, you've been kind of fighting this fight against President Trump on this particular issue, on access to voting for a number of years now, but it keeps coming up in a different way, in a different form. Is that a concern for you, just in the sense that this isn't going away?
Yeah, it's probably not going away, probably as long as President Trump nurses his grudges about the 2020 election. He's convinced the facts are something that they simply are not. They just aren't. There's no plainer way for me to say that. So it's an issue that he obviously cares a lot about. But look, I'm a cautious optimist here. Not only will the SAVE Act, I think, lack the votes it needs to pass, probably, but we have the tools.
Yeah. Probably in the Senate, but you never know. Things can happen.
Yeah, you never know. That's right. That's right. It's possible. Right now, the folks who seem to be counting the votes say that it probably doesn't have the votes, but I think we have the tools in place and the laws in place in Minnesota, and we certainly have the resolve and the alliances and the support of people in Minnesota to push back against attempts to interfere with the freedom to vote. Remember, Minnesota's the voting champion of the United States of America. Over the last decade, we've been #1 in the country in voter turnout, and we want to keep it that way.
All right. Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. That does it for this edition of Talking Points. As always, please email me with comments and suggestions at esme@cbs.com. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.